Welcome to the Knowledge Problem Podcast. The objective of this podcast is to engage policy professionals over thought-provoking and sometimes sensitive topics. We aim to bring these professionals together in a way that does not feed into the tribalist narratives plaguing society today. It is my hope, and the hope of all involved in this endeavor, that by allowing these ideas to contend and challenge each other with mutual respect, everyone who listens will learn something not previously considered.
The opinions and views of all guests do not necessarily reflect the views of the Knowledge Problem or of anyone involved in its production.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Knowledge Problem Podcast. My name is Dominic Malusi.
And I'm Alex Pilkington.
Today, we're having a conversation on climate change and energy solutions. Today, we have Alex Bozmoski.
Alex Bozmoski is Energy and Enterprise's Policy Development and Educational Programmer. Prior to joining Energy and Enterprise, he channeled his entrepreneurial spirit in developing rural energy projects in East Africa and consulting on energy and climate policy for think tanks and a major development bank. He has also worked on several federal and gubernatorial campaigns for Republican candidates.
We also have David Roberts. Vox Media's David Roberts is one of the nation's top energy and environmental journalists, and now is also a senior fellow with the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. We hope you enjoy our conversation today on climate change and energy solutions.
David, Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
To get started, why don't we talk about what got you guys both interested in pursuing a career of climate activism?
I think I got interested through a confluence of two things. One, a deep sense of alienation from conservative thinkers that I looked up to as a young man, when after studying climate science and policy in college, realized that their belittling of the issue was self-serving or underthought or sometimes nefarious. I felt like I had been let down by people that I really respected, and I thought that a philosophy of a conservative philosophy should be more than equipped to handle such a complicated and enormous challenge, and I wanted to get involved in figuring out how we could do that. And then another thing is that I was doing some research in East Africa before I started a company in Kenya and Tanzania, and I had been working with some of the people that have partnered with Europeans through the European carbon market back in the golden age of something called the Clean Development Mechanism. And I had seen some communities that really were made better off by their engagement with the climate policy in Europe and some parts of the rest of the world. And I've also saw some communities and met people that were being screwed. And it just really got under my skin that climate policy could be written in such a way that it makes poor people that are dealing with the challenges of climate change the most worse off, and that it should actually be the opposite, that our responses to climate change should do everything that we can to make the people the most dealing with the problems and least able to pay for their adaptation to climate change. They should be, if anything, better off. So after the whole carbon market kind of went kaput in the throes of the financial crisis, I came back to the States hoping to find a way to bring conservatives to the table to help lead better climate policy in the United States.
I guess I'll jump in. My story doesn't make nearly that much sense. I was studying philosophy in grad school for quite a while and then bailed out of that and was drifting around Seattle unemployed and saw an opening for an editorial assistant at a small environmental web publication and needed a job. So I applied. And once I got there, that was Grist. They're a nonprofit environmental website, news site. Once I got there, I started writing more, and I sort of needed to learn about, I will confess that before I got that job, I had not had any particular interest in environmental issues, certainly had no history in environmental advocacy or organizing or anything, or writing or anything like that. I had no history in journalism either. I really had no history. So I just started writing about stuff and learning about stuff, and I gravitated to climate change for a bunch of reasons. One, just because, and this, I guess, is partly one of the same reasons I went into philosophy, is just that I really like systems. I like systems thinking. I like thinking about systems and sort of emergent effects of systems and how systems evolve. And of course, climate change is the mother of all systems problems. Like it is a system of systems, each individual component of which is like a system of systems. Like it's fractal. There's a sort of systemic complexity all the way down. And so I just found it, honestly, to begin with, I just found it really intellectually fascinating. And I found it intellectually fascinating, but I found most writing about it the opposite of that. My experience of environmental journalism, when I started, sort of like climate journalism was just a tiny subset of environmental journalism, and most environmental journalism was, to me at least, very boring. It was kind of like science journalism, and I care about science. I like science, but that's not really my passion or focus. And I thought, well, if what the scientists are saying about climate change is true, then there are social implications and political and economic. Just psychological, like the stories we tell ourselves, the way we organize ourselves. Like if what our scientists are saying is true, this affects everything, how everything holds together. And the writing we're seeing about it has got this weird, narrow, pinched lens of like climate science. And so I just thought, well, this is like a big, giant intellectual territory that is just fun to romp around in, and there's almost no one else romping around in it. So for me, it was like I was like a pig in shit when I started learning about it, and still am in some ways, despite the sort of depressingness of it. So that's kind of my story. Like I started writing more and more, eventually started writing full time at Grist, and then Vox came and asked me to move over there and do the same thing there. So I've just been really self-taught from the beginning, for good or ill. And just, it's obviously a huge moral and political issue, but just intellectually, I find climate change fascinating.
So the next question I want to ask is basically, where do you guys come from politically? What's your political philosophy? And what do you think are the biggest problems related to climate change? And what do you think climate change is to you related to the science? Because like a lot of us, and for the average listener, they might hear this thing called climate change, and it might be like this all-encompassing thing, right? So I'm not too familiar with the science. So I'd like you guys to help educate me. So first I want to start off with, where do you guys identify politically? And then what do you think are the biggest problems related to climate change? So I want to start with Alex, if you could start us off with that.
I'm conservative. And I think Dave was onto something really important for your listeners, which I'm guessing skew maybe a little libertarian and a little younger on the spectrum. Like there are few issue sets that we know of, that we're grappling with as a society, as humanity, that are as juicy and complicated and fascinating as climate change. you can get some of this in like bioethics or AI, but climate change has so many conflicting, overlapping, and deeply complex trade-offs involved in any decision that you can take to reduce risks now in the future, here or there. We're making decisions under conditions of uncertainty that are spread across time and space, and in a not a black and white way. Those decisions don't yield, knowable results. We have to grapple with, I forget the Rumsfeld quote: known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But we have these probability distributions of different impacts in different places and at different times with different emission scenarios. And you're trying to kind of optimize the benefits, but it's really hard to do it because there's not just one thing that you're trying to optimize for. So even explanations of why it's fascinating and complicated sound too complicated to make any sense. I'm realizing that as I'm speaking. It's just, I think that whatever your interests are, you will not be disappointed by diving in and trying to apply your worldview and your philosophy and the things that you love and cherish, and trying to grapple with what climate change means for those things. That could be as simple as what climate change means for your community and your family and some of the life decisions that you'll be making. But it also means, what on a bigger level, what climate change means for our country, for humanity in the near term and the long term. I want to reiterate that Dave is totally right, and anyone that's not super familiar with this will find a profound treasure trove of really juicy questions to dissect if they start to put in the time.
Yeah, I guess if I had to put a label on myself, I would just say liberal, although I tend to think in the U.S., our political discussions tend to be quite stupid, and our labels tend to be as misleading as they are illuminating. And I guess I just say, by way of background, just on that point, no one serious in American politics these days is advocating for the full-on libertarian minimal government. And no one in U.S. politics these days is advocating for full socialist ownership of the means of production, full socialism. Everyone's basically arguing, what is the right line between them? What is the right level of government intervention and public ownership in the economy? Is it something closer to where we are, or something closer to where Denmark is? Everyone's basically arguing over the details. And insofar as we bring in these sort of categorical labels, we just kind of, I feel like, end up starting dumb arguments that are much more about identity and signaling than they are about actual policy or circumstances in the world. So anyway, all that said, though, I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast would immediately identify me as a liberal. As for the biggest problems, Alex is right. Climate change is every problem. You can go from the micro, like a couple of weeks ago, I just spent several days just diving way deep into mass timber, which is this new building material that you can substitute for concrete and steel, made of like compressed wood that is more sustainable than concrete and steel. And that's just like super detailed and, super interesting on kind of a micro level about that particular industry and that particular set of emitting technologies. Or you can just pull back all the way as far back as you want to and think, well, what does climate change say about the story of humanity on Earth? I think we all in America have this background story in our heads of like human beings steadily becoming more complex, steadily solving their problems, steadily becoming more moral and more technologically sophisticated on this kind of linear rise. But maybe the story is human GDP didn't budge for centuries. Then we found fossil fuels. Then it spiked way up. And next it's going to collapse back down and not budge again for more centuries. Like maybe the story of humanity is just a story of a lucky discovery that gave us like years of basically unearned energy. Maybe not. I don't know. But like the point is, climate change is on sort of every level you can find a complex climate problem to dig in. But just to sort of frame the debate going ahead, because I know we want to get to this eventually, which is about kind of conservatism's ability to deal with climate change. And I, for one, am interested in sort of which of two directions we want to go with that. One is the current Republican Party, which I personally don't think is conservative in any reasonable definition of that term, is the current sort of demographic and social and media and business coalition that is called the conservative movement in the United States, capable of what's needed to address climate change. And then we could step back from that and ask whether stripping away all the sort of venality and whatever else that has taken over the right today, and just look at conservative political and economic philosophy in its best, right, in its most flattering and best form, and discuss whether that is capable of dealing with climate change. and my answer is no on both counts, but I guess I would like to know which one you guys would like to talk about.
So I think that would lead great into sort of our first disagreement or our first challenge. I can pose it to Alex and ask, as a conservative, well, what does conservatism mean to you? And why is it, do you think, that the conservative movement in the United States has been reluctant to enact policies to combat this all-encompassing problem of climate change? So I'll start with that with Alex.
When William F. Buckley Jr. used to be asked that question, he would respond with a quote from Richard Weaver that defined conservatism as a paradigm of essences toward which the phenomenology of the world is in continuing approximation. And he did that just to shut up the questioners, so they didn't have to have the discussion of what is conservatism. In part, it's in part a facetious response, but there's something really serious about it too, which is on a fundamental level, and I'm not equating this with the modern Republican Party or just party politics in general, but there's a rejection of ideology as a appropriate political philosophy. Like the essence, the idea of an ideal that we can create through political institutions and strive for, what a philosopher named Eric Voegelin called the imitization of the eschaton, like trying to impose your ideal view of the world onto society at present. A rejection of that follows from a conservative temperament toward political questions. And I think that there's a lot of conservative scholars that sort of adopt, a temperamental conservatism rather than a rigid, dogmatic version. Though in the history of kind of the right in America, there is such diversity of thought that has forged such unique and sometimes strange bedfellow coalitions. And the most famous of these sort of strange bedfellow coalitions was the one that kind of formed the backbone of the Reagan Revolution between libertarians and traditionalists, with what National Review sort of branded as fusionism, the coming together of a philosophy that put economic liberty above all, and one that looked to the conservation of culture and tradition and local and familial institutions. And another way to say it is like kind of the social issue right and the economic right kind of making a partnership that's always been kind of awkward. The thing that they said brought them together was that even though their motivations might be different, that the ends are the same, which is kind of establishing this realm of liberty in the family and individual economic sphere. But look, I think that in general, the values that people that identify as conservative, which lend very importantly to climate change, include a responsibility to pass on posterity greater prosperity than we inherited, the idea of stewardship of God's creation, the idea of fair play and accountability, economic responsibility, that you ought to be, you should be able to reap the rewards of your hard work, but you also should have to pay for the damages that you cause other people, non-consenting third parties. I mean, there's a lot of important principles, I think, that undergird most of conservatism, or at least what it's really hard, by the way, to define conservatism in an era of Trump. And honestly, I'm going to take this a little towards climate change, and I'll try to wrap it up. But we have to be reassessing this question as the world changes around us and beneath our feet. And I can't even imagine the cognitive dissonance happening in Washington right now as Republicans, after years of, or maybe even being elected on a platform of rejecting the economic stimulus of the Great Recession, and now are, putting their names on something that looks an awful lot like a big chunk of the Green New Deal, except it's not meant to stimulate. It's like life support for an induced coma. But we're talking about direct payments. We're getting half steps towards universal basic income, towards national health care, towards benefits for our unemployment benefits. We even have stutter steps toward universal housing and stuff like that. That's part of the Green New Deal agenda, and these things have Republican faces on them. This is a Republican thing, and so they must be asking themselves, what is conservatism when you're in a crisis like this and we're spending trillions of dollars that we don't have on massive government interventions that are necessary in the moment. So I think that I have no idea, Dominic, if I'm getting close to your question here, but I better just pause so we can move on. But if we want to get back to climate change, I'll do it.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm just trying to lay the fundamental philosophies down just to understand where you guys are coming from so that our listeners know who you are, what your main goals are, what your ideas are, so that when we tackle the problem of climate change, I think that they'll be truly able to understand where y'all are coming from. So I guess, to get into climate change directly, let's start with David. What do you think is the most, are there any ideas floating around, like the Green New Deal, that like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders supports? Do you think that is the best proposal to solve this climate change problem? Does that do enough? Do you think it does too much? Do you think it does too little? What would you say is the best policy prescriptions to solve this massive, massive problem for our civilization?
Well, by way of a kind of meta comment on that, I think the right approach will be what FDR proposed in the face of the Depression, which is just try things, see what works, continue what works. If it doesn't work, throw it overboard, but get active and sort of much more active and nimble. I mean, active and nimble, I guess, would be my meta description of a good climate response, because it's very, very, very difficult to know in advance what the kind of all the consequences of these policies are going to be. We're talking about changing fundamental stuff about our economy relatively quickly, and there's going to be weird, knock-on effects in every which direction. And the best thing we could all do is just acknowledge the problem, acknowledge the difficulties it poses, and stay open to evidence, and stay willing to sort of question our assumptions and change, and change as we need to. So, but all that said, I think my sense is that a lot of people on the right don't really understand the logic of the Green New Deal, or have a very unflattering and kind of caricatured view of the logic. So I'll just kind of explain the logic, which I more or less buy. So I think from the right, it looks like they look at the Green New Deal and say, oh, the liberals have a bunch of stuff that they've always wanted, and now here comes climate change, a big problem that gives them the excuse to just do everything they wanted to do all along. There's no truth to that, but there's more to it than that. And the reason the left has wanted to do those things all along is because the left has always wanted to protect workers and ordinary people from the shocks and swings of fate. That's natural disasters, and that's also the sort of like cyclical swings of capitalism. And all climate change is just a big old swing of fate, a big old exogenous threat that's going to disrupt people's lives. And so they need that much more protection. So, like, of course, the same tools are come to mind. So the logic of the Green New Deal, from a sympathetic point of view, from the left, is roughly as follows: to get to net zero emissions as fast as the IPCC says we need to, which is by mid-century, getting to net zero by mid-century in the US, that is going to require just an enormous upheaval, technological and business upheaval of industries, as there's these massive, really fast transitions to new technologies. It's going to create whole new businesses, create whole new regions of economic activity, but also wipe out some industries and wipe out some areas of economic activity, and wipe out, and there are communities that will be every community will be touched. I mean, if we do the transition at the level and speed that the IPCC says we need to, which is unlikely, but if we do, it's going to be incredibly disruptive in good and bad ways to almost everybody in the country. And right now, the left looks around in the country and sees workers that are just struggling with precarity. They don't have reliable health care. Their benefits are their health care is tied to employment. Their 401k is tied to employment. They don't have any retirement savings. They're all in debt. They're all, the condition of the American worker these days is to be one kind of twist of fate away from ruin, from bankruptcy and disaster. And in a situation like that, in a situation of precarity and uncertainty and stress, people tend to cling to what they have and don't want to change. They're not open to grand schemes of transformation when they feel stressed and insecure. So if you want them to go along with you on this giant transformation, you need to offer them some security. You need to assure them you will be taken care of. Your life will not be ground up in the wheels of this transition. Every community will be protected. Every person will be protected. We'll make sure you don't starve. We'll make sure you don't lose healthcare. We're going to do this giant thing together, and we're all going to take care of each other along the way. So that means that's why the Green New Deal gets beyond sort of like the strict barriers of green or climate policy and gets into social policy. They realize this is more than technological transformation. It's an economic transformation, a social transformation, and people aren't going to do that unless they feel safe and unless they feel like we're all in it together. And that is the point of the Green New Deal, is come with us on this grand transformation, secure in the knowledge that you're not risking your life and livelihood by supporting it, right? So that's why the focus on creating jobs, the focus on guaranteeing jobs, the focus on universal health care. I don't think any of the Green New Deal backers ever really thought that we're going to get all these fundamental policies passed in one giant grand package. It was more about a vision of let's make each other safer and more secure as we head into these stormy seas. So that's, to me, we can argue about details of the Green New Deal or details of various policies, but the philosophy behind the Green New Deal, that basic sort of impetus behind it, yes, I totally agree with. I think one of the great faults of liberal wonks on this, or sort of centrist wonks, has always been this notion that you can just surgically go in and target only greenhouse gas emissions and somehow not perturb anything else. Like you can do this surgically. And I just think it's too big and we've waited too long, and success would be too disruptive for that to work. So I think we just need to embrace the fact that this is a big transformation, more than just of particular industries or particular communities. It's a big transformation of the whole country, and we need to reassure people about it.
Well, what I really liked about the beginning of where Dave started was this acknowledgement that some of the things we try might not work and therefore should be jettisoned. And what that signals to me is an understanding that we don't have this decarbonization experiment mapped out. And it's impossible to map out. In terms of economic, social, political, cultural implications that spread across all the countries in the world in extraordinary rippling effects and over time. And we have not the crystal balls capable of telling us what that looks like. And so there's two underlying assumptions that I would just take issue with. One is this binary view of these, they're not arbitrary goals set by, the IPCC or governments, but they are certainly not binary goals. It's not like we don't hit this number, if we don't get to net zero by 2050, we're all screwed. If we do, we're fine. And it's also not true to say that science is what tells us that, or science certainly informs what these numbers are, but what governs where these goals end up is the ethical variables that we use to calculate the trade-offs of where we set goals, how much it's going to cost, and who it's going to cost to set a more aggressive goal, and the immediate economic benefit of setting a less aggressive goal compared to the long-term costs. Obviously, the most aggressive climate policy that we could possibly have is to completely ban all fossil fuels across the world tomorrow, and millions and millions of people would immediately die. And no one would say that's a good climate policy, even though it would have climate benefits on one extreme. And as you change the distribution of your decarbonization action, you change what the cost profile looks like. So I just think that borrowing urgency from climate change to justify tying it all together into a kind of a vision or into a policy package that is meant to achieve systematic revolution in all spheres of America, of life on Earth, is a little bit more aggressive than our abilities to foresee the future would allow us to do. But what I can agree with, and kind of what Dave is saying here, is that the Green New Deal is more of a, I think this is what you're saying, I don't want to put words in your mouth, it's more of a philosophy than like a legislative policy package. This is a way of looking at how all of these issues could be packaged in a vision for the future, where climate action complements industrial policy and social policy and healthcare policy, et cetera. And I totally believe that a lot of people that are hawking the Green New Deal have genuine feelings that these are importantly intertwined issues. But I would say that when we're looking for the most efficient methods of reducing emissions, we do need a complementary set of lots of policy measures, and it's true that some of them will work better than others, and that some will probably need to be changed over time. And as everything evolves, we're gonna find out things that we need and things that we don't need. But what's most important is, or I think maybe what I'll say is that there's a competing philosophy for climate mitigation, which doesn't require a whole of society view of or projecting a whole of society transformation to mitigate climate change, is to really focus on the discrete challenge of hunting for emissions reductions, which is what Dave was kind of distinguishing the Green New Deal from. And I think that can be the way we go about doing that. Kind of it depends on what sort of, where the emissions that we're hunting for live. So there are policy instruments that very efficiently can cause the mass adoption of existing, demonstrated, deployed, and available technologies. And a transparent carbon tax is, or other transparent and predictably rising prices on carbon are the most efficient way to cause the mass adoption of existing technologies. And then to develop new technology requires a more surgical approach and more government involvement earlier in the technology development cycle. And so those two things kind of go together. And right now, Republicans are mostly living over on the innovation side of that, on the developing new technologies. That's kind of their entry point to climate change. What kind of, I think, unifies an approach to a more targeted approach is, and if Dave's not on mute, I might hear him gag when I say this, but is this concept of, is just true free enterprise. And we don't have anything close to a free energy market, for example, right now. The government has thumbs on the scale on both sides, and there's a lot of competition for political patronage from the fossil fuel sector and from renewables. And that takes the heat off of the competition for customers. And that's super inefficient. The biggest subsidy that oil and gas companies get, or fossil fuel companies get, is this subsidy for free and unlimited greenhouse gas pollution. If you had the bulk of, most of the energy market more situated in a truly free enterprise environment where pollution was priced and government intervention was limited to the development, demonstration, and early stage deployment of new and potentially very important technologies, that free enterprise system would reduce greenhouse gases at like a really rapid rate. And it would help us kind of develop the technological capacity to supply reliable, clean energy technology to the rest of the world now. And I think you can take a view of climate action in the frame of achieving true free enterprise and accelerating technological development as fast as possible and opening up trade such that we can sell these technologies to the rest of the world, and you can look at that in a similar way to the way that Dave is looking at the Green New Deal, because with affordable, accessible, clean, and cheap energy, there are so many systemic challenges in America, but around the world, that are that resolve themselves very easily with more energy. So, I mean, I think you can have a kind of humanitarian view of climate change action without adopting a kind of government-run social transformational agenda, and underpin your like action philosophy on free enterprise instead of on something like the Green New Deal.
No gagging. You keep disagreeing with me by saying things that I agree with. So so first of all, just to start at the beginning, there is something a little arbitrary about the Ipcc goals. I totally acknowledge that. I mean, and I could not possibly agree more that science does not tell us how much to reduce emissions. And it bugs me. I see the political utility of saying science demands this and that, and it's kind of, if you unpack it, it's shorthand for a good point, but it bugs me. This notion that science tells us anything. Science doesn't tell us anything. Ethics, prudence, our values tell us what to do. Science can tell us what is, but our values we bring to it tell us what we have to do to it. The only response I would make to that is, even if the IPCC, the sort of net zero by 2050, even if that's off by a relatively large amount, we're talking about targets and goals that are so far out ahead of what we're currently capable of that it almost doesn't matter, like, which one you pick. Like, almost no matter what goal you pick, urgency falls out of it. There's no, and almost no matter what sort of ethical or prudential judgment you make, urgency falls out of it. The problem has gotten so palpably bad that it's sort of like washed away the differences among a lot of these arguments. It's just so bad that it's an urgent problem almost no matter which way you look at it. So it's like, it's like we're sitting in Florida going, like, we got to go to Wyoming. No, we got to go to like Utah. No, we got to go to Washington. Like, we're on foot. We've barely started. Like, like, can we all agree to just like get moving? So that's one thing. The second thing is, I absolutely would not gag at the thought of using markets to achieve positive, socially beneficial results. I happen to think markets have done that over and over again in this country's history. It's just that, sort of hyper-conservatism to me takes market beyond a sort of like instrument that we can use and makes it into something like a religion or like a state of nature, or like if government backed off, there would be something left afterwards, like a perfect free market. And that's just not like, even if you look at sort of like the Heritage Foundation's list of countries that are most free in the world, even economically free, the ones that are freest tend to have large redistributive social welfare states. So markets are our creations. We can create them such that there are more or less competition, more or less sort of rigid rules bounding what they can do, more or less kind of help from the government for various actors. There are more and less competitive markets. And I really think we should just stop thinking of markets like this kind of sort of hyper ideological or even like theological point of dispute, and just start thinking about, well, where do markets work and where do they not work? Like where are they useful and where are they not? And like Alex identifies one, there's, we have an electricity system in this country that is like the most Soviet sector of our economy. It's an absolute Rube Goldberg mechanism of like overlapping jurisdictions and overlapping rules and contradictory rules and just rules that have built up over time, like cruft and work against each other. And just, it's a mess. And there are some areas, like I think in particular, the spread of, the reason the electricity system started out as a monopoly is because it was all the units involved were so big. You need big transmission lines, big power plants, et cetera, et cetera. But now with the evolution of energy toward more distributed and small scale, and not so focused on just generation, but also now focused on storage and intelligent management and timing, and just sort of the whole electricity world is becoming so much more sophisticated. Innovation is moving out to the edge of the grid, to the distributed side, where the units are much smaller, and consequently, like, iteration is much, much faster, and innovation is much, much faster. And in a situation like that, that is where markets shine. When you don't know exactly what you're going for, or what technologies might emerge, or what you're capable of, you set up a market and tell people there's money to be made. You guys go figure out how to do this. That's a great context for a more competitive market. And I would love to see more competitive markets in electricity. I've written several long articles about this. I just don't think you can take the markets are good as a absolute and apply it everywhere. It's just what do you want markets to achieve? I think, and this is another point I wanted to make on this podcast, which is I think there are lots of areas where conservatives, and again, conservative can mean lots of different things. I'm not talking about the sort of revanchist white male Christian demographic backlash that's currently going on under the name of conservatism. I'm talking about conservative philosophy, conservative economic philosophy, of the sort of back to Milton Friedman and that whole thing. But insofar as there are people who hold conservative economic philosophy, there are tons of places where they could collaborate with climate hawks fruitfully. There are tons of areas in the American economy where old or dumb or kind of regulatory capture style rules are holding back competition and also holding back the decarbonization. Like a ton of the carbon that is still in our economy is there because of rules, because of government, because those industries have money and power and influence over government and work to pass rules and laws and tax breaks and et cetera, that benefit them. I mean, coal right now, the coal industry, not just in the US, but worldwide, is almost entirely a corpse held up by government subsidy and distorted rules. If coal had to compete in an open, free market anywhere in the world, it would die immediately. Like, the coal industry's existence is testament to the power of market distortions to hold back and prevent decarbonization. And you could find a ton of places where conservatives and climate hawks ought to be able to come together around that stuff. But it's also the case, I mean, and I think this audience probably is familiar with the Niskanen Center and Will Wilkinson at the Niskanen Center and Jerry Taylor and these sort of libertarian guys who largely through climate change kind of have been thinking their way out of libertarianism or to a different kind of libertarianism. I think what they say is the countries that work best, where people are happy and economies are healthy and people are free, like the much vaunted Scandinavian countries, actually have fewer regulations on business than we do, but they have much larger redistributive social safety nets. So they benefit from open competition. They benefit from the economic engine of markets, and they also benefit from the social role that redistribution plays, which is to keep people happy enough that they won't revolt, right? Or they won't elect someone like Donald Trump who just wants to blow everything up. They get the best of both worlds. They get the sort of happiness and good health and good social indicators that come with people not being immiserated by markets, but they also have open and competitive markets. And I would just like to see a lot more of that sweet spot applied to climate in the U.S. There's tons of places where it would be fruitful to do so, I think. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I have a question for, is that cool? Can I ask Dave a question?
Well, of course.
All right. Well, now it's just changed into like 7 questions. I'm just kidding. Firstly, our street and Friends of the Earth do this report called Green Scissors, which I think is kind of right in that sweet spot.
I was trying to think of that.
He's talking about that, which is really cool. I mean, and Friends of the Earth is a pretty darn lefty environmental group. I mean, they're like anti-market mechanisms, anti-nuclear. I mean, but they still can come together with a really credible conservative libertarian think tank and identify all these places where there's government failure. It's in like government action is responsible for the perverse incentives leading to these perverse outcomes. And, I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I'm just curious what you guys think. That Dave, have you ever read a philosopher from the 80s, Aaron Waldowski? You know what I'm talking about?
I haven't, no.
So he's got this I think he was libertarian, but this theory of like the colonization of risk, where people tend to recognize, it's kind of an intuitive insight, but after you hear it, but you take more seriously risks that are attributed to what you perceive to be malicious actors. And you take less seriously risks that are attributed to things that you perceive to be good. So if someone who is skeptical of big business, capitalism, oil companies, for example, is presented with the risks of climate change that are in large part due to the burning of fossil fuels, and it's very easy to really attach a lot of moral weight and urgency to those risks of climate change, because they're caused by, what in your gut to be kind of malicious actors. Whereas, someone whose dad works for an oil company, and they kind of have an American dream sort of story where they started with nothing and worked their way up, and they aren't, they own everything, or they feel like they really have claim to the fruits of their hard work, and they had someone in her family that like emigrated from a former Soviet black country. But anyways, like we're capitalism and the fossil fuel industry are naturally good actors. They've made your life better, and your family's life better. When you hear a risk attributed to that industry, it's harder to understand the urgency of it. But like this climate change problem is definitely a confluence of market failures and government failures. And I just have wondered why the issue is much more often presented as only, market failure requiring government intervention, and never as, either the truth that it's both, but never really as government failure, which in a sense is in some of these green scissors sort of things that might be kind of smaller on margin than the free pollution pass, but that's a government failure too, in a way, because it's like, if you say soccer is good, well, is soccer still good if you don't have a referee and everyone's breaking the rules? I mean, there is a government failure if you are not properly refereeing the fair play in a market, in a competition. So I'm just curious of what you think. Like if there's if we could recast this a little bit in a way that would work for people that have different views about the relative good of different actors in our public life or in the economy.
Well, on a kind of like short-term proximate level, I totally agree that is politically promising. I mean, the same thing has happened to the climate debate that's happened to literally everything else in the U.S., which is just that polarization has become this kind of self-reinforcing spiral. And it just like my sense of why people on the climate side aren't willing to make that concession or aren't willing to talk about that more is just that they don't think that there are any good faith interlocutors on the other side, and that anything they say will be used against them by actors who are primarily out to defend their big friends. That's the sort of crude, but also I think true explanation. But on a larger point, I would like to see people who love markets and think they've done lots of good, which, by the way, again, I include myself in, is just to see that the virtue of markets is not some like quality granted by God. It's a practical thing, and there's a practical explanation for it, namely that in circumstances of uncertainty and complexity, that distributed decision making is likely to come to a better equilibrium than any centralized decision making. I mean, that's the basic philosophical insight behind capitalism, and also behind, incidentally, democracy. Like, the idea is just that distributed decision making works better because people on the ground will have a better, more immediate sense of their own interests than people far away will. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think the sort of like success of markets is testament to that. But if you take that seriously, you have to realize that human beings have certain cognitive and emotional limitations. They can see their own interests in the immediate sort of right around them proximal sense, but they are often not that great at assessing their own long-term interests, and they're often very not good at assessing sort of collective long-term interests, and they're just notoriously bad at assessing interests beyond the sort of time frame that is relevant for a normal human being in their normal life, whatever, 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead. But they're just not good at seeing or anticipating threats to their interests beyond that. Like, humans just have limited capacity for that. And but the problem is lots of modern, because we live in this sort of globalized world, there are lots of problems that are slow moving and incremental and kind of invisible and kind of work on this time scale that is designed to escape human attention. And climate is obviously the sort of paradigmatic form of that. Like, it's just not, human beings did not evolve to have their attention captured by something like this. So consequently, they will not be acting within markets in such a way as to be minimizing this risk. They will ignore this long-term risk like most people do. And if they all do it individually, then we're going to do it collectively. So this is sort of like, to me, like the obvious test case of we need an institution designed to look ahead and to think about these systemic long-term risks to step in and put certain barriers or guide rails around the market to nudge it in a particular direction, because otherwise it won't go in that direction on its own, because it's the market, just like the individuals composing markets, are not looking 40, 50, 60, 100, 200 years ahead. You need government for that. Like, that's what government is for. I'll stop rambling there, Alex.
When we think of conservatism, historically, Richard Nixon helped establish the EPA, but since then, conservative thought leaders have sort of shifted into climate change denialism. What level of damage has been done because of that? And do you think that climate change deniers will eventually come to see the light that climate change is something that they have to address? Or do you think that a lot of them are a lost cause?
You guys are asking good questions. I'll just say that they're overwhelmingly good questions because they're so loaded. Last couple of weeks ago at CPEC, I debated Will Happer, and I mean, like, it was Trump's National Security Council advisor on energy, founded, some of these hoaxer think tanks that preceded what he currently runs at the CO2 Coalition. And he's there saying that glaciers have been melting since time immemorial and that CO2 is good for people. And he's given numbers about how much we breathe out. And this guy has he is a tenured professor at Princeton, emeritus. And I just found myself not really it's impossible to argue with this. So what I decided to do was just point out that nothing that had been uttered was in any way what anyone in science considers to be science, and there was no science actually. The poster for the event said, like, come and learn the science, but this isn't how you do science. You don't write a paper, put it on the CO2 Coalition's website, and then do a lecture on PragerU, and voila, it's the same thing as a guy going to the American Geophysical Union, publishing papers, do it through peer review, actually doing research. I mean, but there's a constituency for it. So there's just folks that are going to make a living doing this for a while, and but really, what matters is their constituency, which currently is isolated in a very small portion of the base of the Republican Party, which is why it's important to go to CPEC and to find folks that will break from that that cluster of kind of that still remains of folks intransigent to acknowledge climate risks, or that are indulging in these kind of these conspiracies about the net benefits of climate pollution. Anyways, they've done, to your question, almost incalculable damage. But I will say that they have moments where their stock is up and moments when the stock is down. And it's important that we capitalize on the times when the stock is down, because the Republican Party, for example, has not, for the vast majority of the modern history of the Republican Party, has not been captured by these kind of extreme elements. In 2008, there was a Republican Party platform that included cap and trade. There were the greatest greenhouse gas reduction policy, the most efficient one on planet Earth ever, was in the Reagan administration, accidentally, through the ozone protection legislation and the international treaty. But really, in our country, I'll just say this is an important point, and the one I think, but I've been wrong so far in this podcast, Dave, about where we might disagree. And it's probably be just due to the nature of Twitter. Honestly, that's why I think I'm getting some of your thoughts wrong here. But it's the last time we had major landmark environmental law in America was 30 years ago in the H.W. Bush administration. And from that point, with the Clean Air Act amendments and the UNFCCC ratification, which was the last major landmark environmental treaty that we ratified as a country, through the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act and all the landmark environmental laws, they all have one characteristic in common. They are all of them were bipartisan in Congress with a split government and a Republican president. And that even survives the one that the Republican president vetoed, the Clean Water Act. But there were such super majorities that they didn't even take a roll call vote to override the veto. And this feature of the way that our country gets to environmental law is so critical, and it is very controversial right now among climate hawks. There is a clear preference or view that the only way to avoid, or to the only way for America to adopt a leadership posture on climate change and to kind of lead the world to avoid the worst impacts of climate change in time is a multi-generational, dinosaur hegemony of the Democratic Party involving all branches of government and court packing. And like this idea that we're gonna skip bipartisanship and is the only way. I just am so worried about the consequences of that approach to climate action, because it's never, ever worked for anything. And we need this to work. And so as much as the other party, whatever it is, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, as much as the other party pisses you off, and as much as their historical sins as you see them are unforgivable, we absolutely, unequivocally must understand that it is through a bipartisan compromise, or a series of many bipartisan compromises, that we will take any, not to mention sufficient, action to lead on climate change. So I just implore anyone to not try to think of their preferred solution set in such a narrow of a way that it precludes the ability to negotiate with people that don't think like you. Because that is how we will get this done. We have to find bipartisan policy solutions, even if they're initially incremental and they get bigger over time. Or I don't know how it's going to look, but I do know one thing, which is that when the president signs this, whatever the president is, there will be Republicans and Democrats flanking that president at the ceremonies that sign these bills.
Goodness, so much to respond to these wildly huge questions. I will say on the question of deniers, my sense is that people who tend to think and analyze and write and talk, i.e. most of the people who actually discuss climate change online, tend to overvalue words and messaging and kind of like persuasion and argument. Honestly, I mean, if you ask me, the mechanism for how this has worked is there are powerful interests within the Republican coalition. They came to realize that any practical climate solution was going to hurt them. So they swayed the elites and leaders of the Republican Party, and the elites and the leaders of the Republican Party then went out on right-wing media and told their people it's a hoax. And so a certain number of people adopted the idea that it's a hoax, and a certain number of sort of hardcore kooks, like Alex talking about debating, didn't realize that that it was all kind of a pretense, and really took the hoax thing seriously and devoted their lives to building grand conspiracy theories about why it's a hoax. But I don't think denialism among ordinary Republicans has had almost any causal role in anything. It is the interests, the identity and interests that are doing the work here. It is primarily the interests of members of the Republican Party that are at stake in climate policy. That is why they oppose it. And as long as they oppose it, they will use denialism as long as it works. And now it appears to be sort of like, it lasted much longer than I think anybody thought it would, but it seems to have kind of exhausted itself. And so now they're just sort of switching back. They're finding the next line of defense, which is like, we don't want socialism. We don't want to destroy the economy. We just need to plant trees and bury carbon. But it's the same interests at work with just a different story. And it is the interests that will change or not change, that will change or not change the politics. Going on the internet and arguing with a denier is the single most pointless activity that a human being can engage in. There's just no margin to it. It's not genuinely driven by science. They're not genuinely open to changing their minds. And if they did change their minds, it wouldn't matter. It's not their minds that matter. It is the elites and leaders on the right that matter. And it is interests that drive them. And identity as sort of like the enemy of the libs, the enemy of Dems. And if Dems care about this, then they're against it. Like that's, that's overridden everything else. So I just think this endless discussion and endless history on the side of climate people to find just the right message, just, is it national security? Is it market friendly? Is it God gave us this earth to be stewards? Like this endless quest to find the perfect message to persuade people has just been, like, to a first approximation, a total waste of time. As to the bipartisan question, this is much more interesting. This, I think, Alex, we finally have found something that we genuinely disagree on. It is true that bipartisanship used to be much more common in the U.S. in the post-war era in general, not just on environmental stuff, but in general. And there were reasons for that. And the reasons were not people were more reasonable and more willing, open-minded. It's just that both parties were much more heterogeneous. There were a bunch of sort of very socially conservative, racist Dems and fiscally liberal Republicans up in the Northeast. Like, the parties used to be much more heterogeneous. There used to be a lot more ways of reaching across the aisle, just a lot more cross-cutting interests, a lot more cross-cutting, sort of alignments possible. And some of those manifested in big environmental laws. But those circumstances have changed fundamentally. There is the process of U.S. politics over the last several decades has been one of sorting along every line you can name: geographical, by party, by race, by personality. I mean, you can find the difference almost on any metric you look. And as my sort of colleague Ezra Klein has written in his new book about polarization, what's happened is that all these identities, some of which used to be cross-cutting, all of them have kind of become stacked. So all our fights are the same fight now. like if I tell a political scientist how far away I live from a Whole Foods, he can tell me who I vote for, what music I listen to, like what I think about the size of government, like what I think about gay marriage, name it. Like all the identities have become stacked, and all the fights are one big fight now. And so there's just no margin anymore for bipartisanship. And I would just say, you could say there's no big, grand national environmental legislation since the last bipartisan one 30 years ago. And that is true. But then if you look over the last 10 years and ask, well, where have we made progress on climate change? Where has good policy been passed and facts been changed on the ground? I went several months ago and rounded up about 24 examples of where good climate policy and good clean energy and climate policy had been passed. And one thing every single one of those examples had in common is that they had elected overwhelming numbers of Democrats. They elected Democrats to the state house and both houses of legislature and the governorship, or to the city council and the mayorship. Basically, anywhere Democrats get enough power to overwhelm Republican resistance, they pass good climate and energy policy. As just a matter of fact, whatever your political preference about it, or whether you think it's a good or a bad thing, just as a matter of descriptive fact, good climate and clean energy policy get passed where and when Democrats have overwhelming power. I wish it were more bipartisan. I wish there were more cross-cutting identities. I wish there were more complexity and something interesting. I wish political reality had not become so black and white, but just because we aesthetically and philosophically prefer nuance and prefer subtlety and whatever else, we can't project that onto the world. The U.S. political world has become very binary. And so there's just not Democrats would love to do bipartisan things. I mean, Obama begged John Boehner, begged him for help on stimulus, on every single bill, offered him thing after thing after thing. Boehner, who loved making deals, would be like, yeah, chummy, yeah. And then he would go to his caucus, which has become populated with sort of ideologically hardline Fox viewing nutballs, and they would say no. And he would come back and say no. So Democrats didn't stop doing bipartisan policy because they abandoned it. Republicans won't do it. Mitch McConnell said before Obama entered the White House, the best way for us to defeat this guy is to block everything he tries to do, because if nothing happens, voters will blame him. And to his credit, and I don't often give Mitch McConnell credit, but he was absolutely right about that. He's absolutely right that politics has become a zero-sum game. And Republicans know that, and they will not cooperate with Dems on anything. So what else are people who are exercised about the climate problem supposed to do? Right now, just about the only thing they can do to make change is go to their city or state level and elect overwhelming majorities of Democrats. That's the only thing that currently seems to work. If Republicans become open to bipartisan cooperation on climate change at any point, anything beyond we'll plant some trees, that's not bipartisan cooperation. Whatever. If a single if Joe Manchin says, okay, I'll sign your tree bill, voila, then Republicans have a bipartisan tree bill. But whatever. I'm talking about genuine cooperation on solving the problem. If they're open to that, Democrats would rush to it. Democratic voters and politicians, and polls and surveys show this over and over again, cooperation, want their leaders to cooperate, are much more likely to sort of second guess and criticize themselves and think the other guy has a point than Republicans. This is just a social science, inarguable social science result. Republicans don't like cooperating, and they punish their leaders who cooperate. So when that state of affairs changes, I think there will be opportunities for bipartisan cooperation. But in the meantime, we got to do stuff. Stuff's got to get done.
Yeah. In the meantime, stuff's got to get done, which is impossible to get done in split government, and the pendulum always swings back. So unless we can find that bipartisanship, it is hard and tougher. But without it, we can't get this stuff. NRDC and all these guys, they worked really hard on the Clean Power Plan. Pendulum swings, poof, right? And now we're unwind the whole thing, and we're now finally, we're working on some bipartisan, incremental, clean energy stuff, where we were before COVID. And, things are coming out of Senate ENRs. Things are, they're kind of warming up these collaboration
They're not,
muscles
those
again.
things keep failing. Those things, there's tiny things have been stewing in the ENR committee for years now, 6 years, these incredibly modest, negligible policies. And even those can't seem to actually get through. To me, what's going on in ENR is evidence of how wan and dead bipartisanship is. If that's what it can do, that's not very impressive.
Well, we have to figure out how to reinvigorate it, because the idea that there will be one party hegemony for a long enough period of time to sustain climate action that matters has never been, our country has never really sustained a political commitment to anything for more than a decade. This goes back to the beginning. We couldn't stick with Reconstruction, and the unbelievable human suffering that it caused because we lost the political will to stick with that has been replicated on pretty much anything that we've come together and said we want to do. But eventually it fades. We have to sustain a political commitment across the parties to be durable for a period of time that's kind of unprecedented in the history of political will in America. And
yes, it's all unprecedented and all wildly unlikely. The likely outcome is failure. I'll be happy to accept that. Well, let me just ask you one question point blank before we're done then, Alex, because the reason I think bipartisanship has not happened is pretty simple. The oil and gas industry, the coal industry, the sort of building trades and road builders and sprawl industry, that whole sort of collection of industries, they are firmly attached and deeply embedded in the conservative coalition and are the source of much of its money and electoral muscle. And number two, reducing greenhouse gas emissions means shrinkage and let's just say shrinkage for all those industries. It means diminution for all those industries. There is no, you can argue there's going to be some gas left, whatever, that we're going to be using oil for a while, whatever. But if we move aggressively on emissions, those industries are going to shrink in number and in power and in political power. And they know that, and so won't go along with it. And they are in control on the right. So to me, that's just an equation that leaves zero. There's no room there. It's not that they haven't found just the right policy instrument that they can get behind. It's their existence that's on the line. There is no policy that eliminates greenhouse gas emissions that does not eliminate greenhouse gas emitters, or at least radically shrink them. So there's just no squaring that circle. So where is the impetus for bipartisanship on that side supposed to come from?
Okay, a couple of quick answers. One is just anecdote. I asked this question to Bob Dudley, who's the CEO of BP, because he was on a panel. He didn't talk about climate change. I managed to corner him, and I got this question. And it was, in 75 or 100 years, is BP gonna be drilling for oil? And his answer, I just wanted to see, long term, are you thinking out of your current business? There's tons of massive conglomerates and huge companies in the world that started doing something completely different and just kind of evolved with the time, and do things very different now. And his answer was, we'll probably still drill it, but it won't be combusted. But which I had to think about that. What kind of things are you thinking you're going to make with it? But obviously he's thought about it, and it gave me a little bit. It was a little bit of insight into kind of the way that they might be thinking about it, because right now they're looking at predictability, and which is why most of the major oil and gas companies have increasingly robust carbon pricing advocacy, contributions. I know that there's a lot of question marks around that, but like it is a marked change from the past. I will say this: right now, I do feel a drag on the Republican Party's movement toward a total reposturing on climate, towards climate policy that comports well with a small government worldview, which is where we should be. And the drag has a very few and reducing number of sources. And they're basically a couple kind of coal magnates, a couple family, like large and influential families that pour tons of money into kind of like think tank and political apparatus that can kind of gum up the works to make any progress on an issue. The part of the premise of Merchants of Doubt, the book, is that it really takes a tiny investment to sow doubt and slow things down or to stop something. It takes tremendously more energy to get something past the finish line. So really, the drag on our reposturing here is a couple refiners, a couple coal interests, and a couple families. And it's really not. It's not like a giant web of like a hydra-headed beast of all these industries that are opposing climate action. I mean, like that. There was a lot more like that decades ago, but it's been reduced to a much more manageable number of actors. It is infuriating that such a small number of actors can gum up the works so effectively, and I'm very anxious to overcome those obstacles. But we, even with more drag than we have right now, 10 years ago, we had bipartisan Republican, coalitions with Republicans working on climate bills. I mean, and I need to get in this jab because you made it sound, Dave, like Obama was really doing everything he could to get climate policy passed. And it's just, there are some Republican senators that would very much take issue with that after months of painstaking, negotiations with industry and labor and environmental groups and Democrats to forge consensus or to forge bills that stood a chance to go to conference. That was, depends who writes the history, but very credibly kind of torpedoed by the Obama administration. So like everything is a trade-off. And when the Obama administration, just like everyone else, makes trade-offs, and climate policy was on the cutting room floor to give priority to other things. And I mean, we're only 10 years removed from robust bipartisan tries at climate change. So it seems kind of ridiculous to say that our better shot is with this completely historically unprecedented unipolar America with dominance of one particular party. I mean, do you think that party's not going to split if you really get that kind of dominance? And ignoring all historical precedent and the fact that we're not that far removed from having more obstacles and some decent progress toward major legislation. So I retain a sense of optimism that we have demographic tailwinds, we have industrial tailwinds, we have economic and political tailwinds that are all getting us closer to being able to come together on climate change. And I just have to believe that we are capable of this as a country, of governing ourselves and getting to something that we do together that is big. I have to believe that, Dave, or it's too depressing otherwise.
Conservatives in every other major developed democracy in the world seem to have worked their way around to accepting this problem and the need for substantial action. So there is productive debate happening in other countries and productive bipartisanship happening in other countries on this issue. So I would just say that if you're looking around for the unique culprit for why there's none here, it is the unusual and extreme nature of our conservative movement and our conservative party. Like absolutely, if the Dems completely took over, eventually there would be a split, and eventually we would get what other countries have, which is a sort of center-left party and a center-right party, each of which with their own fringe. Instead, we've got a center-left party and a Republican Party that's become almost completely just sort of revanchist, nationalist cry of fury against demographic realities. If the Republican Party can get past that or through that somehow, or reconstitute itself somehow, I think it will find willing partners to fight this problem.
So, gentlemen, this is freaking long. Any listeners that have made it to this point, God bless you. You are very amazing people. Really.
Luckily, everyone's stuck at home. So, what else are they going to do?
I think it's time we move on to final thoughts. David or Alex, whoever wants to go first, I'll let you guys make the decision.
Alex, you go.
Yeah, okay. I'll sum it up because my daughter has been cooped up in her bedroom with my wife, and I can hear her yelling, "Daddy!" She's like, "Get off the damn phone." But you know what? I'll just say this. This is the first time I've talked to Dave. I think we have different worldviews, but we share this kind of common enemy in climate change, and it's really important to both of our careers and our purposes. And it is a lot easier to find the common ground to get, to have conversations that are productive and you learn something in this format where I got to listen to you than in the more common formats that we're used to interacting, like Twitter. So my final thought is climate change is super important. We got to get bipartisanship. It's super juicy and worth your time if you can invest in learning about why it's important to you and what you have to contribute to it. And spend time talking to people and reading their long form writing and before making or generating your impressions based on social media because they're just compared to having a conversation, Twitter sucks. That's my final thought.
This, I feel like, is an area of bipartisan agreement that we can embrace. Twitter sucks. Don't ever draw any conclusions about anything based on Twitter. I guess I would just say, by way of conclusion, because perhaps I'm speaking to a slightly more conservative audience than I usually speak to, I would just say that laying aside all the other questions of U.S. politics, who's to blame for what, who's trying to do what, who wants what, just on the just on the subject of climate change, if you just narrow into climate change, I think it is pretty clear from the evidence and from ongoing circumstances that the Republican Party is the primary impediment to good climate policy in the U.S. We can, there's arguments to be had about what shape that policy ought to take, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, the Republican Party is just almost totally intransigent about it, kind of a little bit starting to poke its head out of its bunker and make tiny little steps. This sort of hilarious climate package that Matt Gaetz and Marco Rubio are trying to put forward, which is what is every climate policy we can think of that won't disturb any fossil fuel company? Wait a minute, trees. But I'll just say, if you are a conservative who, unlike most conservatives, recognizes the scale and severity of this problem and wants to do something about it, you need to think about reforming and changing the Republican Party on this question. I wouldn't necessarily even say that about every issue, down the line. And not like there are other issues and other problems in American politics where the blame is much more widely spread or even concentrated on the left. And we could talk about those some other time. But on this issue, it is the current constitution of the Republican Party that is the problem. And people who, like, I can't change the Republican Party. They don't listen to me, but they will listen to the young people within the Republican Party and the people who have thought their way through to the truth on this issue. So I would just say on this issue, please sort of heal thyself. Talk to other Republican leaders and elites about changing the message on this and changing the message that's coming through right-wing media on this, which is in many ways working against people like Alex and even sort of like the policymakers who are trying to kind of poke their head up a little bit on this. They risk being decapitated by right-wing media. So right-wing media needs to change about this too. So this is a place where if you want bipartisanship and you want progress, it begins with changing the Republican Party's disposition on this issue. That's all I'd say.
Thank you guys so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Dominic. Look forward to listening to your podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. Enjoy your day, guys. Really great job. I really enjoyed this.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Knowledge Problem Podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider following our social media accounts to stay up to date on new developments in the show and to share your opinions. We'd like to give one final thank you to our guests today for taking the time to engage in productive conversation. We would like to also thank our sponsors, Young Voices.